Hi everyone, my name is Callie Smith. For this COMS 550 research paper, I have selected immediacy, verbal and nonverbal communication in the classroom. My research, I paid particular attention to the positive correlation between those two factors and how it really, verbal and nonverbal communication behaviors positively motivates students within the classroom setting. I've also included a PowerPoint presentation to go along with this visual presentation, so if you would like to follow along, feel free to do so. So in this presentation, I will be covering the definitions of immediacy and then as a subhead of that, verbal and nonverbal immediacy. I will also cover the research findings, which relate positive teacher immediacy to student motivation, as well as a biblical application. So before we get started, I'd like to ask you a question for you to be thinking about while I go through this presentation. Have you ever had a professor, teacher, pastor, coach, instructor of some sort that the way that they acted and the way that they verbally or non-verbally communicated with you really encouraged you and made you want to do your best within the classroom setting? And that's motivation. That is motivation through verbal and nonverbal communication. I was very pleasantly surprised when I started doing my research and I realized that most of the research that had already been conducted in this particular topic was in support of my thesis that verbal and nonverbal communication behaviors positively affect student motivation in the classroom. So to get started, immediacy, as defined by Chesbrough and McCroskey, refers to the perception of psychological and physical closeness. This was an idea that was initially elaborated on by Albert Mehrabian in his book in 1971 called Silent Messages. He really developed the idea of immediacy and pursued it into the field of education as it pertains to the classroom setting. In relation to the classroom, this actually refers to the relationship between teacher and student, as I mentioned before. So the difference between verbal and nonverbal communication behaviors. Verbal communication behaviors, or otherwise known as explicit messages, examples of that: tone of voice, clarity, word choice that the instructor uses to convey an idea or a concept. Nonverbal communication behaviors or implicit messages: physical proximity, where the teacher stands in the classroom, eye contact that they make with the student while they're teaching, or do they move around the classroom while they're teaching to kind of give that laid back, relaxed feel to the classroom, like, oh, it's just kind of casual in here, just walking around and teaching. That kind of usually gives the students a little bit of a sigh of relief when they realize, oh, this teacher's not like, really intense and stands behind their podium the whole time, just glaring over the edge of that podium at us and just throwing information at us. It's specifically important to note that verbal and nonverbal behaviors supplement one another. They are complementary to one another. You have to have consistency with your verbal and nonverbal communication behaviors to avoid confusion with the recipients of your messages. So some of my findings that I had on the verbal influence on motivation. Students feel motivated when the content of the instructor's message is positive and uplifting. Students whose teachers actively engage them in the classroom discussion and also ask for their opinion feel that they have a more important role within the classroom and are therefore more motivated to succeed there. Students whose teachers directly call them by name feel more emotionally connected and valued as an important part of the class dynamic. Finally, students who have observed teachers engaging with students both inside and outside the classroom feel less intimidated by the teacher's position of authority. They feel less intimidated to go up and approach the teacher for clarification, to ask questions, that sort of thing. Additionally, I have a lot of research findings on the nonverbal influence on motivation. Students who feel that their teacher remains close to the class while teaching feel that their instructor is more laid back and easier to talk to than an instructor who remains behind a desk or podium the entire time. A personal example of this, I remember my freshman year of college, I had a professor who never left from behind her podium. She actually leaned over the podium and almost like laid on the podium the entire time, which that directly affected the projection of her voice, the tone in her voice the entire time she taught. So most of the time you looked around the class and everybody was falling asleep because the content that wasn't necessarily boring or unimportant, the way that everybody was perceiving it because of her verbal communication that was affected by her nonverbal behaviors, everybody was just bored out of their mind, and it was a very unpleasant thing to sit through 3 days a week. Finally, students who feel that their instructors make eye contact and comfortable facial expressions perceive their instructors to be more relatable and open to discussion and interaction. They're more comfortable with them if they think that they're a little bit more laid back and relaxed. Also, students who feel that their teachers communicate positive reinforcement and encouragement through appropriate touch are more inclined to be motivated to achieve higher standards. So I very vividly remember really struggling on an exam one time, and the professor was walking around the class just making sure everybody was doing all right, and she stopped at my desk and noticed that I was having a really hard time, and I could feel her reading over my shoulder. She was reading the question that I was having a hard time with, and I had crossed out 2 of the answers, and I was debating between 2, and I remember that she patted me on the shoulder, and I turned around and she winked at me and kind of saying, you got this, and almost instantaneously I felt so motivated to succeed, not just on that question or on the test, but in the class as a whole, because I knew that her positive influence on me, she was backing me, she supported me, she was rooting for me. In the next slide, I've included this diagram as a visual representation of the actual direct correlation of positive teacher immediacy and student motivation. So that's something that you can just look at if you have time, if you have a spare minute, to just check that out and kind of put a shape or a diagram to what I'm discussing here. So finally, the biblical application. And some of you might be going, how in the world does this relate to the Bible or Christianity or the Christian worldview? So building relationships with fellow Christians is vital. It's essential to your spiritual health and overall well-being. Through those close relationships that you develop with other believers and like-minded individuals, we become encouraged and motivated to become better versions of ourselves and better in our walk with Christ. So the same way that you develop a positive relationship with your teacher or your instructor that motivates you to do better in the class, you develop positive relationships with fellow believers. You're going to be more motivated you're going to be more motivated upwards. You're going to be more motivated to get closer to Christ and develop your walk with Him further. Additionally, this can relate to the Christian worldview by being consistent with your verbal and nonverbal behaviors, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Consistency is key. So what you're saying, you need to show it. You need to express that on your face and show what you're saying. Because we never know who we're talking to and when we're talking to them. Through our communication, we can convey the love of Christ to those who don't know Him. So finally, the verse that I really felt like pertained best to that biblical application as Ephesians 4:29, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear it." I hope you guys have enjoyed my presentation. Thank you so much for watching, and I wish everyone the best of luck in the rest of the class. Thanks.